Wednesday. And through the rest of this week, it stays pretty lively. Gusty winds, but not as stormy. Some further spells of rain, but also some sunnier days as well.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Coming up in the next very busy hour, we think we'll be live in the House of Commons as Boris Johnson prepares to tell MPs and the country how we must now learn to live with COVID. How will the changes affect you? What happens in the workplace? To tests in schools will run the rule over the PM's announcement as he makes it. And in other news, the Queen and COVID and the latest on Storm Franklin. Alongside me throughout the next hour, the free speech campaigner Claire Fox. But first, the headlines today.
Good afternoon, I'm Tamsin Roberts. It's 4 o'clock in the GB newsroom. The UK will offer an additional COVID-19 booster jab from spring for the most vulnerable. People aged 75 years and over, residents in care homes for the elderly, and people aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed will be eligible. These groups will be able to receive their fourth jab from around 6 months after their last dose. Health Secretary Sajid Javid said he accepted the advice from the Independent Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation and that all 4 parts of the UK intend to follow the advice. The Prime Minister is due to deliver his Living with COVID plan shortly in the House of Commons. And you can watch it here live from around 4:30. Boris Johnson's cabinet was due to sign off his plan this morning, but it was delayed after reports the Health Secretary made a request about how elements of the blueprint will be funded. The Prime Minister is expected to remove all remaining domestic COVID regulations in England by the end of this week, including mandatory isolation after a positive test. The British Medical Association says that would be an odd decision. Virologist Dr. Chris Smith says if restrictions change, people should be encouraged to use common sense.
At the end of the day, if you've got gastroenteritis and norovirus, you generally don't go to work. You don't send your kid to nursery. There's no legal framework that says if you do, you're going to get prosecuted. That's what they're removing, the legal framework. But hopefully the learning, the common sense, the ability to make decisions and risk assess that we've actually become pretty good at doing over the course of the pandemic, that remains in play.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has opened a meeting to consider recognising the independence of two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. The leaders of both the rebel-held Donetsk Republic and Luhansk Republic have called on President Putin to recognise their independence. Vladimir Putin says Russia is considering recognising the independence of two regions, but not annexing them formally, adding them to its own territory. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told the Commons Britain has a strong cause for concern that Vladimir Putin is still committed to an invasion of Ukraine. He urged the Russian president to rule this out.
In the last 48 hours, contrary to Kremlin assurances, we have seen a continued increase in troop numbers and a change in force disposition, moving from holding areas to potential launch locations. I believe he is in danger of setting himself on a tragic course of events, leading to a humanitarian crisis, instability and widespread suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but also of the Russian people.
Environment agencies have issued hundreds of alerts for flooding as Storm Franklin continues to sweep across the UK. It follows yellow weather warnings that have been in place since this morning but have now been removed. Transport networks have been suffering further delays, with some train operators asking passengers not to travel because of the conditions. 32,000 homes are still without power following Storm Eunice over the weekend. 6 fire engines and around 40 firefighters have been called to a shop fire in Stamford Hill in Hackney. Most of a ground floor shop below some flats and part of the first floor of the building were alight. The brigade was called to Old Hill Street at 2:45 this afternoon. There are currently no reports of any injuries and the cause of the fire is not known at this time. An investigation into childcare services in Solihull has found that some details were entered incorrectly into police databases, leaving children at risk of potential harm. The investigation was launched after 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes was murdered in 2020. In a number of safeguarding cases, officers in Solihull were found to be over-optimistic and lacked professional curiosity. Investigators reported examples of separate records being made for the same individual because of spelling errors in their name and children not being linked to the system to family relatives who could pose a risk to them. There's a new drive to help uncover Britain's working-class history. Historic England have announced that local communities can apply for grants of up to £25,000 to fund research projects. The aim is to research everyday history in places like railways, council estates and pubs. The project is the first of a series planned for the next 3 years, exploring the diversity of England's heritage. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Brazier.
Well, an hour coming up of potentially quite some significance. In the next few minutes, Boris Johnson will take to his feet in the Commons and explain how his government wants people in England to live with COVID, is expected to lift restrictions and put the emphasis for containing coronavirus on individuals and businesses rather than on the state. The legal obligation to self-isolate will become guidance to do so. Free testing, which is currently costing £2 billion every month, will come to an end for all but the most vulnerable. That's what we think is going to be announced. The move is not being followed in Scotland nor in Wales, where the Welsh Government called the decision, quote, premature and reckless. Dozens of scientists have signed an open letter deploring the decision. But for those who've campaigned for a return to some kind of normality, the PM's announcement, which we will of course bring to you live as it happens, is a major punctuation mark in Britain's pandemic story. Joining me throughout the free speech campaigner, Claire Fox, who will be listening to what the Prime Minister has got to say. Claire, welcome to you. It's nice to have you here. What do you want him to say?
Well, I think we all anticipate that he is going to go very hard on saying it's now up to us. We've got to take responsibility for our own health situation. We don't expect that you're going to all run around infecting each other, that you'll be sensible, and we trust you. Now, I hesitate because obviously I've been thinking, but you could have done that a while ago. And here he is saying it, maybe. But I would hope that he will basically hand us back the responsibility, and that's what we should have done
just for the
a while ago.
Those were library pictures.
Oh,
Apologies if
good.
you're
He's not
listening
about.
to radio.
I suddenly thought he'd gone right. So the only other thing I'd say is that the difficulty we've all got, and this is something I'm not sure what's going to happen, is there's a lot of people who've become rather reliant on these kind of rules. It kind of gives them a sense of certainty. And one of the things that is a bit nerve-wracking is that whilst it can say, well, it's only guidance and we'll let you make your own decisions, I think if you look at what's happened, for example, in care homes, where care home managers have almost refused to lift regulations when they've been officially lifted, and there are still people who are in terrible isolation, not being allowed to see relatives in care homes. You can see already that lots of workplaces are saying, oh, well, actually, we still won't let you, still should only come in 2 days a week.
Yeah.
I was in an Uber, and the guy said, well, we don't know whether they're going to keep having these kind of rather daft restrictions and rules that we have to follow. So I think that it will be a great relief. I think it's quite brave, even if he's doing it for opportunistic reasons, but I don't think it will mean that we're quite free as a society.
I'm going to quote Tim Stanley. I recommend anybody who hasn't read his column in the Telegraph this morning to try and get hold of a copy, because I think it was one of those columns that sets the tone a little bit, part of which read, how do you persuade, this is Tim Stanley's question, how do you persuade a society that you have terrified and infantilised for 2 years that it is safe to go back in the water? He suggests that some of the nudging that was happening to nudge us in the direction of being terrified, as he would put it, ought to be used in the other direction now.
I think that we will require more than this statement today. I think what we need in terms of leadership, actually, we've seen a little from the Queen, to be fair. I mean, she said, I've got COVID, but I'm carrying on working, everybody. And you do think, oh, that's impressive. But that kind of leadership where you actually encourage people. So I don't want them to deploy, God, I never want them to deploy nudge again. And I don't know that boosterism quite is the antidote to fear-mongering. But what I genuinely think needs to happen is that people in public life should say, we now need to put all our energy into rebuilding social ties. We should stop being frightened of each other. So not just saying we'll lift and leave you to it, but also encourage, do what we can to give leadership, to say to universities, no, get everybody back to face-to-face teaching.
Yeah. Or charge less.
Or charge less. But, I mean, actually, they need face-to-face teaching. I mean, they're university students. They need to be part of a collegiate atmosphere at a university and actually learn the odd thing.
Claire, as do office workers.
And all of us, indeed.
As do we all. For now, Claire, thanks very much indeed. Back to you very soon. As soon as the Prime Minister takes to his feet, we will take you there live, of course. But in the meantime, let's try and get away some of the other stories of the day. And we'll start with this one. Storm Franklin became the third named storm to hit the UK in the space of less than a week, leaving thousands without power and causing widespread flooding as well this time. There were 87 miles per hour gusts and torrential rain. That was last night. Currently, there were 450 flood warnings in place. The River Severn threatening to breach flood barriers. Let's talk more about this. The former BBC weatherman, John Ketley, joins me now, I'm delighted to say. John Ketley, thanks for sparing the time today. Appreciate it. Can I just roll the clock back a little bit to Thursday afternoon? And I was in a discussion with colleagues here, just as the first red warnings were coming in for Storm Eunice, and we were trying to calibrate what our journalistic response ought to have been to it. We decided that felt like something new, and actually, as the next 48 hours unfolded, we learned, didn't we, that actually the Met Office, with those warnings, probably saved lives this time.
Absolutely, yes, Colin. Good afternoon to you. It's nice to be the warm-up act before the Prime Minister comes on as well, by the way. But yes, it was a pretty serious time, wasn't it, at the end of last week when the red warning was put out for the southwest initially and then across into the southeast of England. And it turned out to be a very, very accurate forecast from all companies. And of course, there were a loss of life. There was a loss of life, 3 or 4 people, I believe. But because everybody was forearmed and forewarned, all the emergency services got a handle on it probably 48 hours early. It really went very well in a sense that everybody was in the right place to sort things out. A lot of communications by travel were abandoned for the 24 hours, so there's no traffic, no rail into Wales, for example. So I think people did listen, and they listened early, and they cancelled their journeys, didn't go into work so much. Far cry from how it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, Colin, when we used to have these big storms, and there was a much, much bigger loss of life with those storms which came along 30 or 40 years ago.
In terms of the difference between now and then, I mean, I'm guessing at the fingertips of forecasters now, there's a lot more computational firepower. They have a processing ability to project ahead, and that's just based on the speed of mathematical programming. They're just able to crunch more numbers more rapidly.
Oh, absolutely right. Trillions of calculations per second with these supercomputers at Exeter, for example, with the Met Office. It was nothing like that 30 years ago. It was nothing like that probably 20 years ago. It's getting better all the time. We know that. Costs a fortune, of course, to buy these computers. But yes, it's much easier to get an accurate forecast just a few hours down the line now in great detail, in a much smaller scale, so you can actually pinpoint where the severity of the winds and the weather, the rain, is going to be much more accurately. And we've seen these pictures over the past few days bringing stormy conditions. This is the latest one, Storm Franklin, which came along, well, during yesterday, really. It was pretty strong winds yesterday afternoon, and it got stronger through the night across Northern Ireland and down through parts of England and Wales, gusting up to 70 or 80 odd miles an hour. And I think, thankfully, there's been no loss of life from this storm, and people have managed to hunker down, as it were. But there has been some heavy rain. There's been some more flooding. And of course, it's very bad around Cheshire at the moment, South Manchester, a place I know well because I started my career in Didsbury, living in Didsbury, just travelling down to Manchester Airport. So it's always been a flooding area with the River Mersey in that particular area. And it's the same with the River Severn now, of course. But yeah, the forecasts have been very accurate indeed. And a few more bumps in the road, I've got to say, before this lot's out of the way. Franklin's going now. It's into Central Europe. But there will be more wind and rain coming in the next few days. And I think it's, in a sense, maybe not so much the wind, but some more heavy rain causing further flooding problems for the northwest.
Or problems if you've got a gaping hole in your roof because half a dozen tiles have been removed by Storm Eunice in my case.
Yes, absolutely true. But it's my panels in the garden which I've lost, a few panels there.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's a tale that's repeated up and down the country, isn't it? That is for sure. But would have been worse, John, without that advance warning on Thursday. For now, thanks very much indeed. John Ketley joining us there. Claire Fox alongside me. Just for one reflection while we've got time to think about something other than COVID, Claire, on the weather. And I know we tend to joke about 87, the Great Storm, Michael Fish, how they got it wrong at the Weather Centre. But actually, that must have been and for people like John Ketley, his generation of weather forecasters, there was a huge responsibility on their shoulders to get it right, the prediction business right, because, you know, people really blamed them when it went wrong.
Well, actually, this does relate to the COVID stuff, because I think that this shows you the importance of accurate warnings, not over-the-top warnings, not crying wolf. Although I rather fear that some of the closures and did ape the COVID playbook. You know, all trains from Wales cancelled. I mean, I've got family in Wales. It caused havoc, let me assure you. And you didn't need to do that. But I think accurate warnings where people feel that they know what to expect and can be suitably restrained in the way that they deal with it is a very good way to deal with emergencies like this.
To be fair to the railways in Wales, they'll say they had 1,000 miles of track to check for debris.
I know, but still.
For now, Claire, thanks very much. Now, yesterday, Buckingham Palace confirmed the Queen had tested positive for coronavirus, as Claire Fox was saying there, providing us with an example by carrying on working. She's said to be experiencing mild cold-like symptoms and is still carrying out those light duties. Let's turn to the historian and royal biographer Robert Lacey to ponder on this one. Hi to you, Robert Lacey. Very nice to see you again. It's interesting that the palace have been quite, I mean, by palace standards, and I stress it's relative, fairly open and transparent about her condition and how she feels right now.
Yes. Well, I think they've got a good story to tell, haven't they? I mean, within hours, apparently, of testing positive, there she was, getting in touch with our curling ladies in China and telling them how well they'd done. It's rather a miracle. She's lived so long and reigned so long that the technology, virtual technology that we're taking advantage of now, enables her actually to carry out her duties in a light fashion. That's what the palace has said, isn't it? And of course, for the Queen, duty, be it light or heavy, I mean, I think is what keeps her going. I think most other people would agree with that. And you know as well as I, the story out of the palace is upbeat. I've just recovered from COVID last week. It was like a heavy cold. And I hope Her Majesty is suffering no more than that in the same way.
Robert, we've only got a minute and a half, and I'm very keen to get your perspective on the current woes that have gripped the palace, particularly around Andrew. She's 96 in a few weeks. The Platinum Jubilee celebrations were meant to be this sort of punctuation mark in the royal story in a positive way. Just give us a sense of where they're at right now institutionally, the monarchy.
Well, after sticking with her son for a long time, she has now clearly ruthlessly jettisoned him so far as the Jubilee is concerned, which is supposed to celebrate all that's good about the monarchy, and nobody can pretend that that's what Andrew stands for anymore. More immediately, there's the challenge of Prince Philip's memorial service coming up at the end of next month. Now, he has the right to go. He should be there to mourn and pay tribute to his father. But let's hope he won't do it as he did at the funeral and actually grab the microphone virtually away from other members of the family. I imagine he'll be there, but we will not see him in a prominent way. And then, Colin, next time perhaps we've got to discuss this whole question of cash for access. At the moment, it's Prince Charles's staff who are carrying the can, but actually to have the heir to the throne in prospect of being interviewed by the police, rather like our Prime Minister, that does raise a question about the monarchy in the months ahead.
Robert Lacey, very good to talk to you. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much. Claire Fox alongside me to ponder on the future of monarchy. I like the institution. I think it allows human stories to be played out on a big stage, and I think we can learn lessons from that, sometimes quite good, sometimes quite bad lessons. And I like the fact they are a genuine alternative. They are an alternative to our elected executive. I don't think you feel that way.
No, well, I'm from a Republican tradition, but I've not been somebody that's actively spent my time flagging off the monarchy. Yes, exactly. If you want, one of the issues that we have all got to face at the moment is many of the institutions that, in a way, have kept society together, been some kind of a cement, been some kind of historic continuity, are all looking rather dodgy and looking rather frayed. And that fracturing and insecure aspect of suddenly the monarchy crumbling isn't one that actually makes me cheerful, even with the Republican background, because you do actually think, oh, God, I wish that they'd hold their act together. One of the things that we can just reflect on, though, is that the attempts at modernising the monarchy, kind of making the monarchy, get up to date, maybe going, trying to get in touch with young people and so on and so on, have basically been backfired terribly. I mean, either you've got a monarchy that stands apart as something very different. Once it tries to be part of the people, you actually see the hypocrisy more and more.
Bits of it have always gone wrong. I mean, anybody who remembers the 1970s, and dare I say it, it's a royal knockout.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there have been some dreadful experiments at trying to be down with the kids, etc. But isn't it the case now that when I think, speaking of kids, a conversation I had with one of mine recently about Meghan, huge approval, Charles, very negative. And I was appalled at that because I'm a huge fan of Charles. I think he's a terrific future king, and I think Harry has behaved abominably. But that's not how a TikTok generation sees things at all.
No, but that's what I'm saying is that what's happened is we judge them on the same basis on which we judge a lot of people, which is right on politics or not. Whether we think they're on the right side of history, all of these kind of things. I mean, You'd have to kind of decolonise Charles and Camilla to keep certain generation happy. But that's what I'm saying is once you start playing that game, i.e. once you allow the monarchy to be politicised in that direct way, which they've done, I mean, their PR people have done, then you're going to fall foul of it. And so, actually, that's not good. Just, I suppose, finally, to reflect that they are in a bad way, though. I mean, there's a lot of things, and I think that access point and the Prince Charles point that was just made, that's more damaging even than Harry. We've got used to Harry and Meghan. We all know about Andrew. The last thing that the royal family needs is another 3 or 4 of those, and they really are in trouble.
I would stress, and whatever, the inquiry may result in something different, but I think the point is it was well-intentioned.
Well, I understand that. All I'm saying is once you can throw that dirt and it begins to stick a bit, it's difficulty for them.
Claire, for now, thanks very much indeed. We're not talking really about the royals or Storm Franklin today. We're here to talk about the Prime Minister, and after the break, we will go live to the Commons as soon as Boris Johnson gets to his feet. We'll also speak to an employment lawyer to find out if your boss can force you to stop working from home and get back into the office. First, though, the weather.
Hello. The winds are easing as Storm Franklin clears away, but there's going to be some heavy rain around, certainly for a time tomorrow, before we see brighter skies generally through the afternoon. There's Franklin disappearing, and we've got a brief bump in the isobars, a brief ridge before this next weather system comes in, and it'll be that brings some heavy rain during tomorrow. For many, though, it'll be dry and fine through this evening. The winds continuing to ease down, still quite gusty on the east coast, but even here the winds ease through the night. Some patches of frost over northeast Scotland with some clearer skies before that next set of weather fronts arrive, bringing cloud and patchy rain initially, but then some heavy rain to western Scotland and Northern Ireland by dawn. And the winds will pick up once more in the northwest. Temperatures mostly holding up above freezing, but as I said, through this evening we could see some pockets of frost. Certainly tomorrow morning, that rain is going to be heavy across initially southern Scotland, but then spreading into northern England and Wales, easing a little as it spreads over the Midlands, and then just turning things damp across East Anglia and the southeast around the early afternoon. Clearing away and then leaving sunny spells and just a few scattered showers, which will be of snow over the hills in Scotland. Temperatures 8, 9 across the north, 10, 11 further south. Breezy, but nothing like as windy as today. During Tuesday evening, again, clear skies will allow it to turn quite cold for a time before we see another weather front, bringing more rain and strong winds back across Scotland, again with a bit of snow likely on the hills here. And that rain will only slowly creep southwards during Wednesday, spreading into Northern Ireland and eventually Northern England. For most of England and Wales, though, it'll be dry on Wednesday, just a few showers for Wales and the southwest. Some sunny spells across the east. It will be windy, though, so the temperature's 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with that wind on Wednesday. And through the rest of this week, it stays pretty lively. Gusty winds, but not as stormy. Some further spells of rain, but also some sunnier days as well.
I'm Liam Halligan. Join me every weekday at 1 p.m. for On the Money, your daily dose of economics, business and consumer news. I got 25 years experience covering economics and finance. We hold grown-up discussions with a host of experts who really know their stuff. We can't buy gas and store it. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
I think it was a mistake.
Even you, Liam, don't have a crystal ball.
Inflation's a real threat. Every weekday at 1, you're On the Money.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very warm welcome back. You're watching Colin Brazier on GB News on TV and on radio, expecting to see the Prime Minister on his feet in the House of Commons very soon. But in the meantime, I'm going to show you, bring back that graphic, would you? What will the COVID announcement to be made by the PM any moment now mean to you? It looks like the biggest impact will be on people still working from home. Government mask mandates and vaccine passes went a while ago. The biggest single change expected to be announced today is the legal requirement to self-isolate. We're also likely to also see the end of universal free tests announced. Well, this morning, the Small Business Minister, Paul Scully, confirmed with GB News that it would be down to businesses themselves to decide whether staff should stay at home if they test positive. They will also have to choose if they pay for tests for their workers. Well, the details will be made clear soon, very soon, but we know that firms have a legal duty to protect their employees, leaving them vulnerable to legal action if they allow sick staff into work or are seen as tolerating an unhealthy environment. Here is the settlement we expect then for workers come the end of today. If you have, time for that graphic, if you have COVID, your boss can't force you in, but they might choose to make you provide proof of a positive test. On working from home, you have a right to request to continue working from home, but you do not have the ability to insist on working from home. Is that clear? Your employer only has to consider it. And when in the office, if it's up to your boss, if you continue to wear a mask and continue to test regularly. Let's turn to an employment partner at Howard Kennedy, that is James Townsend. James Townsend, thanks so much for your time. I do appreciate it. And apologies if we have to cut you short. It'll be the Prime Minister that's upstaging you in the Commons, so I suppose we'll make no apology for that. Tell us about what this will mean, you think. I mean, obviously, we don't know the detail yet, but employers have a duty of care to their staff, don't they?
Yeah, well, Mr. Scully this morning did say he was going to be producing more guidance, so we're waiting to see what the guidance actually says. But you're quite right. Employers owe a duty of care to look after the health, safety and well-being of their employees. And when it comes to COVID, it's going to be quite an interesting situation. I think a lot of employers have been relying upon the legal requirement for people to self-isolate. That's now going to change. So employers should probably be looking at updating their policies to state exactly what should happen as and when somebody contracts COVID. I think it's really interesting as well to point out that if your employer requires you to self-isolate, they are effectively medically suspending you. And in those circumstances, there is a legal obligation to pay you your full salary. And I think that's something that hasn't been talked about quite a lot and is quite interesting. Employees, on the other hand, they have a right to self-isolate if they're unwell for any reason for up to 7 days. So if you're not feeling well, you can say to your employer, look, I'm going to self-isolate for 7 days. I'm not feeling well. I'm going to self-certify. After that, they could go to their GP, perhaps by video call might be sensible if they've got COVID, to sort of ask for a medical certificate exempting them, because you can, of course, be very unwell if you contract COVID.
I suppose, James, in all this, it's likely most, particularly bigger companies, are going to pursue a policy of enlightened self-interest, aren't they? In the sense that it is in their interests to offer, for instance, free tests to employees, because then that allows them to monitor the situation to make sure that people who are infected are taken out of their workforce and stop spreading a virus that could ultimately result in many more members of staff being depleted from that workforce.
I think employers have become very used to COVID now over 2 years, and I don't think we're going to see any sudden changes. Nobody wants to go into the office and work with a colleague with COVID, and in fact, if your employer forced you to do so, that could open them up to legal action if you, say, became unwell or something like that. So we would expect to see employers continue to offer hand sanitizing, supply masks, possibly even encourage people not to come into work if they suspect they have COVID. But as I said, it's really important to note that if an employer says do not attend work if you are unwell, then in those circumstances the employer is under a legal opportunity to pay you your full salary.
I mean, presumably so much of this, I mean, we're treating this conversation as if all businesses are the same. And obviously size makes an enormous difference. With mass and scale come things like HR departments who probably have a different approach to COVID and the regulations that govern how a business responds to it than, say, a small, medium enterprise with 10 to 50 employees.
That's right. And the resources that are open to an employer are going to depend upon what they do. But it's in everybody's interests to be reasonable about this. There may well be some employees who say, look, I just don't want to attend the workplace. We've had a few cases go through the employment tribunals at first instance that have looked upon whether or not you can withdraw your labour. There is a legal right for employees where they think that they're going to face imminent danger in the workplace to withdraw their labour. However, an employment tribunal has looked at this and has said at first instance, well, it's as dangerous in the workplace as it's society at large, so perhaps that isn't an argument that will succeed. Somebody else, I think, put forward an argument to say that they had some philosophical belief in not attending work, and that failed. So it's all about being reasonable, sensible. If you're unwell, don't go into the office. Self-certify as an employer. Do the right thing and pay people either statutory sick pay, or if you really require them not to attend the office and they want to attend the office, then you should medically suspend them and pay them their full pay.
James Townsend, thanks very much indeed for your time. Appreciate it. Claire Fox alongside me, waiting for the Prime Minister to get to his feet in the House of Commons. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, is still talking. So we were told 3:30. It's 3 minutes past the half-hour mark. So we're across it as soon as the Prime Minister takes to his feet. Of course, we'll be there. Just on the point about what happens in workplaces, I'd like to think there'll be a great bonfire of signs in a lot of companies. I don't think there will be.
No, you see, you can tell that we're not going to get back to normal anytime soon when we have this extraordinary conversation about whether you're going to be an irresponsible person or not to go into the office when you've got COVID. And the whole point about an announcement today, which should take us on the road of saying that we do not look at our fellow employees or colleagues at work through the prism of their medical conditions. You know, if somebody's ill, God love them. You know, I hope they have a few days off and, you know, give them a Lemsip or take whatever measures you need to do to get well. But that's with colds, with flu, with any other things, you know, if you've got a stomach bug or all the rest of it. To see this sort of thing where you say somebody's, you know, maybe ill, but they feel well, and they go in and they pass on bugs. You know, we see each other now as germ carriers. I mean, you know, I don't want that. I think that's very ungenerous. I understand the difficulties the employers get into, and they're worried, and then but there are obviously serious social implications if people say, I refuse to go to work if I'm a bit ill. I mean, think about what that will mean for the future of any kind of productive society. I was a teacher for many years. I mean, you would say, well, I feel rotten, but you'd teach.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you were accused of, and if you just sort of said, I don't feel great, I'm having the day off. I mean, the kids never got taught. It's bad.
If we can, I want to pull up, if the technical wherewithal is there, if we can pull up the signal from the House of Commons so we don't miss the beginning of the Prime Minister's statement, which I'm told is imminent. I'm not sure this means that Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, is finished. I'm told he's still going, but it's looking like those green benches in the House are pretty full. There is Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, who's just talked about the possibility of 1 million refugees being created by a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll keep across those pictures just so you see the Prime Minister as soon as we see the Prime Minister. Claire Fox is alongside me. We're talking about what the Prime Minister's announcement might mean for businesses. And I just wonder, Claire, actually, I'd like to say that there will be this great bonfire of signage and companies will go along with this. One of my big problems with woke HR departments is that they ignore the bulk of their employees, actually, and there's a sort of democratic deficit because of that. I think in this instance, actually, if you polled a lot of your staff, you'd find out a lot of them, if the polls are to be believed for the general population, that a lot of them quite like some of the regulations, so keep them.
Well, I mean, I understand, you know, especially think about it generationally. If you think about it, well, I mean, any of us, right, on a cold, miserable day like today, going to work's miserable. And if somebody said to you, you've got a legitimate reason never to leave the house and we'll pay you, I mean, whether you like it or not, I'm not making any cynical points about furlough or laziness. I'm just understand that instinct. But I think that, in general, one has to push oneself to get out of the house.
Here we go. Here's the Prime Minister.
And here's the Prime Minister. He's got out of the house and he's here.
Prime Minister.
And before I begin, I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen for a full and swift recovery. It is a reminder that this virus has not gone away. But because of the efforts we've made as a country over the past 2 years, we can now deal with it in a very different way, moving from government restrictions to personal responsibility. So we protect ourselves without losing our liberties, and maintaining our contingent capabilities so we can respond rapidly to any new variant. Mr. Speaker, the UK was the first country in the world to administer an approved vaccine and the first European nation to protect half our population with at least one dose. And having made that decision to refocus our NHS this winter on the campaign to get boosted now, we were the first major European nation to boost half our population too. And it's because of the extraordinary success of this vaccination programme that we've been able to lift our restrictions earlier than other comparable countries, opening up last summer while others remained closed, and keeping things open this winter while others shut down again, making us one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, with the fastest growth anywhere in the G7 last year. And while the pandemic is not over, we have now passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with cases falling, hospitalisations in England now fewer than 10,000 and still falling, and the link between infection and severe disease substantially weakened. Over 71% of all adults are now boosted in England, including 93% of those aged 70 and over. And together with the treatments and scientific understanding of the virus that we've built up, we now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. As we have throughout the past 2 years, we will continue to work closely with the devolved administrations as they decide how to take forward their own plans. And today's strategy shows how we will structure our approach in England around 4 principles. First, we will remove all remaining domestic restrictions in law. From this Thursday, 24th of February, we will end the legal requirement to self-isolate following a positive test. And so we will also end self-isolation support payments, although COVID provisions for statutory sick pay can still be claimed for a further month. We will end routine contact tracing and no longer ask fully vaccinated close contacts and those under 18 to test daily for 7 days. And we will remove the legal requirement for close contacts who are not fully vaccinated to self-isolate. Until the 1st of April, we will still advise people who test positive to stay at home, but after that, we will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others. Mr. Speaker, it's only because levels of immunity are so high and deaths are now, if anything, below where you would normally expect for this time of year, that we can lift these restrictions. And it's only because we know Omicron is less severe that testing for Omicron, on the colossal scale we've been doing, is much less important and much less valuable in preventing serious illness. We should be proud that the UK has established the biggest testing programme per person of any large country in the world. This came at vast cost. The test, trace and isolation budget in 2020-2021 exceeded the entire budget of the Home Office. It cost a further £15.7 billion in this financial year and £2 billion in January alone at the height of the Omicron wave. We must now scale this back. From today, we're removing the guidance for staff and students in most education and childcare settings to undertake twice-weekly asymptomatic testing. And from the 1st of April, when winter is over and the virus will spread less easily, we will end free symptomatic and asymptomatic testing for the general public. We will continue to provide free symptomatic tests to the oldest age groups and those most vulnerable to COVID. And in line with the practice in many other countries, we're working with retailers to ensure that everyone who wants to can buy a test. From April the 1st, we will also no longer recommend the use of voluntary COVID status certification, although the NHS app will continue to allow people to indicate their vaccination status for international travel. Mr. Speaker, the government will also expire all temporary provisions of the Coronavirus Act. Of the original 40, 20 have already expired and 16 will expire on the 24th of March. And the last 4, relating to innovations in public service, will expire 6 months later after we have made those improvements permanent via other means. Second, we will continue to protect the most vulnerable with targeted vaccines and treatments. The UK government has procured enough doses of vaccine to anticipate a wide range of possible JCVI recommendations. And today we're taking further action to guard against a possible resurgence of the virus, accepting JCVI advice for a new spring booster offered to those aged 75 and older, to older care home residents and those over 12 who are immunosuppressed. The UK is also leading the way on antivirals and therapeutics, with our antivirals task force securing a supply of almost 5 million, more per head than any other country in Europe. Third, SAGE advised there is considerable uncertainty about the future path of the pandemic, and there may, of course, be significant resurgences. They are certain there will be new variants, and it is very possible they will be worse than Omicron. So we will maintain our resilience to manage and respond to these risks, including our world-leading ONS survey, which will allow us to continue tracking the virus in granular detail, with regional and age breakdowns helping us to spot surges as and where they happen, and our laboratory networks will help us understand the evolution of the virus and identify any changes in characteristics. We will prepare and maintain our capabilities to ramp up testing. We will continue to support other countries in developing their own surveillance capabilities, because a new variant can emerge anywhere. And we will meet our commitment to donate 100 million vaccine doses by June as part of our agreement at the UK's G7 summit to provide 1 billion doses to vaccinate the world over the next year. In all circumstances, our aim will be to manage and respond to future risks through more routine public health interventions, with pharmaceutical interventions as the first line of defence. Fourth, we will build on the innovation that has defined the best of our response to the pandemic. The Vaccines Task Force will continue to ensure that the UK has access to effective vaccines as they become available, already securing contracts with manufacturers trialling bivalent vaccines which would provide protection against COVID variants. The Therapeutics Task Force will continue to support 7 national priority clinical trial platforms focused on prevention, novel treatments, and treatments for long COVID. We are refreshing our biosecurity strategy to protect the UK against natural zoonosis and accidental laboratory leaks, as well as the potential for biological threats emanating from state and non-state actors. And building on the 5-point plan I set out at the UN and the agreements reached at the UK's G7 last year, we are working with our international partners on future pandemic preparedness, including through a new pandemic treaty, an effective early warning system or global pandemic radar, and a mission to make safe and effective diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines available within the first 100 days of a future pandemic threat being identified. And we will be hosting a global pandemic preparedness summit next month. Mr. Speaker, COVID will not suddenly disappear. So those who would wait for a total end to this war before lifting the remaining regulations would be restricting the liberties of the British people for a long time to come. This government does not believe that that is right or necessary. Restrictions pose a heavy toll on our economy, our society, our mental well-being, and on the life chances of our children. And we do not need to pay that cost any longer. We have a population that is protected by the biggest vaccination programme in our history, We have the antivirals, the treatments, and the scientific understanding of this virus. And we have the capabilities to respond rapidly to any resurgence or new variant. And, Mr. Speaker, it is time that we got our confidence back. We don't need laws to compel people to be considerate to others. We can rely on that sense of responsibility towards one another, providing practical advice in the knowledge that people will follow it to avoid infecting loved ones and others. So let us learn to live with this virus and continue protecting ourselves and others without restricting our freedoms. And in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just... Mr. Sherman, please. Can I just say, I understand the statement was important and the Prime Minister did run over, so I'm more than happy for the opposition leaders to also run over. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by sending my condolences to the family of Christopher Stalford? Christopher was a dedicated servant of the people of South Belfast, and his loss will be deeply felt. I'd also like to send our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen, and as the Prime Minister said, the whole House wishes her a speedy recovery. Can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement and for the briefing earlier this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, huge efforts have been made over the last 2 years, and we would not be where we are today without the heroism of our NHS and key workers, those who pioneered and rolled out the vaccines, and the sacrifices that people made every day to follow the rules and protect our public health. We must honour the collective sacrifices of the British people and do everything possible to prevent a return to the loss and lockdowns we've seen over the last 2 years. The Prime Minister promised to present a plan for living with COVID. But all we've got today is yet more chaos and disarray. Not enough to prepare us for the new variants which may yet develop. An approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it. This morning, he couldn't even persuade his own health secretary to agree the plan. So what confidence can the public have that this is the right approach? Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place for a moment longer than necessary. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity.
Order. If you can't show the respect that I expect the Prime Minister to be heard inside, I expect the Leader of the Opposition. If you don't wish to be in here, there's plenty of room outside this chamber. I suggest you start using it, and I'll be helping you on your way. So let's have silence. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we have to take the public with us, and that requires clarity about why decisions are being made. So will the Prime Minister publish the scientific evidence behind his decision to remove the legal requirement to self-isolate, including the impact on the clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom lockdown has never ended? Having come this far, I know the British people will continue to act responsibly, and they will do the right thing, testing and then isolating if positive. What I can't understand is why the Prime Minister is taking away the tools that will help them to do that. Free tests can't continue forever, but if you're 2-1 up with 10 minutes to go, you don't sub off one of your best defenders. The Prime Minister is also removing self-isolation support payments that allow many people to isolate and weakening sick pay. These are decisions which will hit the lowest paid and the most insecure workers the hardest, including care workers who got us through the toughest parts of the pandemic. It's all very well advising workers to self-isolate, but that won't work unless all workers have the security of knowing that they can afford to do so. The Prime Minister mentioned surveillance and the ONS infection survey. This is crucial to ensuring that we can ramp up testing and vaccination if the virus returns. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he has put the funding in place to ensure that the ONS infection survey will not see reduced capacity and that it will be able to track the virus with the same degree of detail as it can today? We can't turn off Britain's radar before the war is won. Ignorance is bliss is not a responsible approach to a deadly virus. It actually risks undoing all the hard-won progress the British people have achieved over the last 2 years. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has published a comprehensive plan for living well with COVID. Our plan would see us learn the lessons of the past 2 years and prepared for new variants. His approach will leave us vulnerable. Where's the plan to secure the UK's supply of testing? Why are schools still not properly ventilated? As a nation, there is no doubt we need to move on from COVID. People need to know their liberties are returning and returning for good. But this is a half-baked announcement from a government paralysed by chaos and incompetence. It is not a plan to live well with COVID. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really thought this was going to be the moment when he would end his run of making the wrong call on every single one of the big decisions. But, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, he's had the chance to back the government on the big decisions, and I'm afraid that he's got it wrong. And just to turn to some of the points that he's made, the evidence for what we're doing today is amply there in the scientific evidence, in the figures for the rates of infections that I've outlined today, and in all the data that is freely available to members of the House. And they can see what's happening with infection rates, with mortality, with what Omicron is doing across the country, Mr. Speaker. He asks about the clinically extremely vulnerable, and that's, of course, an entirely reasonable question. But what we are going to do is make sure that they continue to be protected with priority access to therapeutics and, of course, to vaccines as well. He asks about testing, Mr. Speaker, which is absolutely satirical, because week after week, month after month, I've listened to the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, complaining about NHS testing, denouncing the cost. Did you not hear them, Mr. Speaker? Denouncing the cost of NHS test and trace, and now they want to continue with it when, Mr. Speaker, we do not need to go on with it in the way that we are currently doing. So he asks about our ability to do tests, or our domestic ability to manufacture tests. It's as though he doesn't know, Mr. Speaker, that we have in this country now one of the biggest manufacturers of lateral flow tests in Europe. Mr. Speaker, this is a leader of the opposition who, as I say, has shown an absolutely ferocious grip of the wrong end of the stick. He never ceases to amaze. He was wrong on July the 19th. If you remember, totally wrong. He said we shouldn't open up on July the 19th. He said that the Labour Party, there he said that we needed a roadmap back into lockdown, Mr. Speaker, during December. They wanted to stay. He voted several times. They wanted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, and contrary to his denials in this House, Mr. Speaker, he voted several times to do so. He's been consistently wrong on all the big calls. He was wrong then, he's wrong now. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is moving forward in a balanced, sensible and proportionate way. Moving forward away from legal compulsion in a way that I think the British people understand, and trusting in them and trusting in their great sense of personal responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support today's announcement, which is a tribute to British science and to the government's leadership in the vaccine programme. Does the Prime Minister agree, when it comes to future pandemics, that the real danger zone are those early months when we don't have a vaccine against a new virus? And in that context, it's not just whether the NHS can cope, but whether the NHS can cope without switching off other vital life-saving treatments. And if he agrees with that it is not just enough to say that we have more doctors and nurses than we had before, but that we also need to make sure we have enough doctors for the future. And if he has plans for that, would he please tell the House how he will make sure that we are actually training enough?
I thank my right honourable friend very much. And he's returning to a theme. He's returning to a theme that he's mentioned several times. We have a vast plan, Mr. Speaker, to recruit more nurses and more doctors than ever before. There already are more in the NHS than at any time in our history. We have 45,000 more now this year healthcare professionals than there were last year, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to fund them.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This statement was billed as a Prime Minister's moment of pride, but it's clear that this morning has been a moment of panic for this government. Disagreement across Whitehall and a lack of any serious engagement with the devolved nations shows that these decisions are bereft of science or consultation. It appears these dangerous choices are purely political and have been made up on the hoof. It is another symptom of a government in turmoil. The illogical reality of UK finance means that these decisions, made for England by a failing Prime Minister, affect the money the devolved nations have to provide testing. It is unacceptable that the ability to protect money, I hear money. We're talking about protecting the people of Scotland, something that this Prime Minister is turning his back on. And it's unacceptable that the ability to protect our population can be imperilled on the basis of a political decision taken by a Prime Minister in crisis. His decisions directly affect whether Scotland has the funding required to keep its people safe. That is the ridiculous reality of devolution, but it's a reality that must be addressed. So will the Prime Minister now confirm what the residual funding for testing will be to enable the Scottish Government to pick up the pieces of this chaotic withdrawal of support? Mr. Speaker, it makes the case for Scotland to take necessary measures to keep our people safe. We need the financial ability to make our own choices. That, Mr. Speaker, only comes with independence. Mr. Speaker.
I will also hear the Leader of the Opposition in silence. I don't need the barricking. He certainly doesn't need it. I don't need it. In Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. PCR testing, the legal requirement to self-isolate and access to lateral flow testing have been instrumental, Prime Minister, in containing the virus. As we move forward to live with COVID,
It is exactly 5 o'clock. You are watching ongoing coverage of the government's announcement of how England will live with COVID.
Long-term implications. They also hamper vital surveillance efforts and impede the ability to respond to new variants. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we have a Prime Minister beset by chaos and mired in a police investigation for breaking his own COVID laws, and he can shake his head, but that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. A Prime Minister who has no moral authority to lead, desperately seeking to appease his backbenchers. We know this reckless statement flies in the face of advice from scientists at the World Health Organization. That's because this statement is not about protecting the public. It's about the Prime Minister scrambling to save his own skin.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't believe it from what the right honourable gentleman has just said, but the cooperation between the UK government, the Scottish authority, has been outstanding and will continue to be outstanding. And I can tell him. He asked about free tests and how they're to be paid for. I mean, it's very important. The free tests will, of course, continue until the beginning of April. And of course, if people want to continue beyond then, and I've set out for the House the reasons why we think it's much more sensible to focus, Mr. Speaker, on surveillance and spotting new variants, put our investment into that rather than mass testing. Then he has, Mr. Speaker, access to the 41 billion record settlement that he has under Barnett. And he also, Mr. Speaker, has access to hundreds of millions hundreds of millions from the health and care levy. The only astonishing thing is that he voted against it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement the Prime Minister has made. The Prime Minister will also be aware of growing international evidence that lockdowns have been largely ineffective in preventing COVID mortality. And we're acutely aware of the massive damage which has been done economically and to non-COVID health of the people due to lockdowns. Will he review pandemic planning for the future to make sure these crucial lessons are learned?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's right to draw attention to all sorts of studies about the efficacy of lockdowns. We'll look at all the evidence. I happen to think that the collective actions of the British public were indispensable in saving many, many thousands of lives, Mr. Speaker, but I'm sure that all the evidence will be looked at in the course of the inquiry.
Hilary Benn. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. New antiviral drugs have made a huge difference to the treatment of COVID. They are indeed, as the Prime Minister says, the first line of defence, but they work best when given early. Now, one of the requirements at the moment in order to qualify to get an antiviral drug is that the person has tested positive for COVID. If the Prime Minister is going to get rid of free lateral flow tests, how are people going to get access to those medicines?
Mr. Speaker, obviously, great respect to the right honourable gentleman. People who are symptomatic will, of course, continue to have access to testing.
It's a birthday person, Sarah Bretliff.
Programme is the reason that we're in this position today, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody involved in Highburn and Haslingden for the rollout of the vaccination programme and those who have had to deal with the restrictions for longer than most. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that this is exactly why we must learn to live with the virus due to how damaging restrictions can be on mental health and well-being?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And we have to set all these decisions, the cost of lockdowns, the cost of on people's mental health and well-being, against the difficult decisions that we have to make about opening up our society. And I think the House understands that. I think this is a balanced decision that is entirely right. I should just clarify to the right honourable gentleman that, of course, those who are vulnerable, who are symptomatic, will, of course, continue to have access to testing. And I should have said that in my answer to his question.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent survey, the majority of NHS leaders agreed it was not the right time to end free testing for the public. Can the Prime Minister tell me why he disagrees with those NHS leaders and what scientific advice he has considered to come to this decision, which could have a real impact on the NHS elective recovery plan?
I hear the anxieties of people, but I have to say that I think that this is the balanced and the right decision. Testing, and I just remind her of what her benches have previously said about the cost of testing. We now think that the best thing to focus on is, given the severity of Omicron, the best thing is to focus on surveillance and to use the huge funds that we're currently dedicating to mass testing on electives and all the other things that we need to do.
Clark.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Sir Andrew Pollard of the Oxford Vaccine Group said this morning that it doesn't make a big difference whether the decision to lift these restrictions is taken now or in a few weeks' time. So it's not clear what the purpose of waiting any longer would be. But one of the things that we do know in the past is at times we didn't have the testing capacity that we needed at times when we needed it most acutely. So given the ongoing surveillance, if that were to throw up a variant that was more dangerous than Omicron, how quickly can we stand up and deploy again mass testing?
I thank him, and that's exactly the right question, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're putting so much emphasis on surveillance, on the ONS, with its amazing granular ability to detect what is going on in local areas, as well as other forms of surveillance. We want to spot the new variant of concern as soon as we can, Mr. Speaker, and then we want to surge our testing capacity in the way that we did before, and of course much faster now, since it is all ready to go. We will have stockpiles, Mr. Speaker. We will keep our labs in readiness, and we will be able to surge where necessary. But now is not the right time to continue with mass testing. Or from April, it will not be the right time to continue with mass testing in the way that we have.
David.
Can I join the Prime Minister in sending our very best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen and hope she gets well soon? Mr. Speaker, there are millions of family carers across our country taking regular lateral flow tests to ensure they don't pass COVID on to their vulnerable loved ones. The Prime Minister now says these families' carers must pay for COVID tests out of their own pocket, even though so many family carers can hardly make ends meet at the moment. Is the Prime Minister really telling people they must choose between money for the weekly shop or a test so they don't accidentally take this contagious virus into their loved ones' homes? Surely such a tax on caring would be unfair and unjust.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to draw attention to the need to honourable gentleman's right to draw attention to the need to protect care homes and those who work in care homes. He should wait until March, when we'll be setting out in more detail those who will continue to be entitled to free tests.
The man for the rules, Matt Hancock.
Mr. Speaker, almost 2 years ago now, this House voted unanimously on the statutory measures necessary to keep people safe during the pandemic. And I agree with the Prime Minister that now, thanks to the vaccines, these measures are no longer necessary, and indeed that we're the first major country in the world to be past the pandemic. Yeah. But isn't it extraordinary that despite that consensus on restrictions back then, the consensus on giving people back their freedom, which is often so much harder, and trusting to personal responsibility, that consensus appears only to exist on this side of the House.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a great shame that the opposition cannot find it in themselves to support what I think is a balanced and proportionate approach, and one, Mr. Speaker, that recognises that COVID has not gone away and that we cannot throw caution to the winds.
Rod Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, given everything else the Prime Minister said this afternoon, why is he keeping the bureaucratic and irritating passenger locator form when the whole of the rest of Europe can already travel freely by showing a vaccine certificate?
Right. Well, a welcome call for liberty from the opposition benches, but I can tell him that we already have one of the most open travel systems in the world, and the passenger locator form, I understand his grievance against it. We are certainly reviewing it by Easter.
Sir John Redmond.
Great news that our freedoms are being restored. So can the Prime Minister now bring that same focus and government innovation shown on this topic to vanquish the cost of living crisis so that more people have enough money to enjoy the freedoms?
Yes. You bet, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not know how well the vaccine works on immunocompromised people, and they and their loved ones will rightly be extremely worried. And as the Honourable Member for Leeds Central raised, there are delays in getting test results, thus delaying access to life-saving antivirals. Can we allow them to have a supply of antivirals at home? Because if his pharmaceutical interventions would save lives, let's make sure that they can access them ASAP.
Mr. Speaker, we've already secured more antivirals and therapeutics per head than any other country in Europe. And what we need to do is ensure that those who are clinically extremely vulnerable do have access to them, and 1.3 million of them have already been sent tests.
Colin Brazier.
Mr. Speaker, whilst the threat from COVID has changed, thanks in no small part to the outstanding vaccination efforts led by my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he will know that the effects on local hospitals will last for years to come. Does he agree with me that now is the right time to invest in upgrades to hospitals like Scunthorpe?
Now is exactly the right time, Mr. Speaker, to invest in hospitals like Scunthorpe across the country. I cannot give a commitment to the particular project that she described, but it is the kind of project, Mr. Speaker, 48 of which, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we are progressing across the country.
First of all, can I welcome the fact that we're having these restrictions lifted, and I hope that the Prime Minister will engage with the Health Minister in Northern Ireland to make sure that the same measures are exercised in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister said, though, that it is important that we get our confidence back. We have lived through 2 years of fear being instilled in the population. Can he tell us what nudge tactics he now intends to engage in to ensure that that confidence is restored so that people can get back to work, back into the shops and restaurants, and back doing the things which make life enjoyable?
Parties. Perhaps I could begin, Mr. Speaker, by echoing the condolences for the DUP MLA, Christopher Salford. And Mr. Speaker, I agree wholly with his sentiments. We do need people to get their confidence back. And as I said the other day, what I think people can do, they can set an example. They can go to work, Mr. Speaker. I think going to work is well, you wait and see. Going to work, Mr. Speaker.
David Davis. Cheer up the Prime Minister by welcoming what he has to say today. And say to him that the comment of the Leader of the Opposition that the government had no plan to deal with this was destroyed by his own right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, who pointed out that antiviral therapeutics were incredibly effective, 95% effective against this disease. And am I right, can the Prime Minister confirm that we have 2.75 million courses of such therapeutics available to us already?
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm that. What I can tell him, in fact, we have twice the amount. We have 4.9 million doses.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Living with COVID does not mean ignoring it, and he will be aware that lifting of restrictions today flies in the face of advice from many NHS leaders and health experts, including the BMA and the World Health Organization. And saying everyone should take personal responsibility, while at the very same time taking away the very means that would allow them to take that personal responsibility, is utterly perverse. So what would he say to those of my constituents, particularly those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, for whom his Freedom Day is a day of profound fear and loss of freedom? And would he clarify his response to the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton? Because it's not just an issue of free testing for people in care homes, it's a question of free testing at the very least for the almost 7 million carers up and down this country.
So just on that, Mr. Speaker, she should wait, as I said to her right honourable friend from Kingston and Surbiton. And on the clinically extremely vulnerable, I think it's very important to remember that they do have, and we will continue as we have throughout the pandemic, to look after them with all the therapeutics that we can, with vaccines where that's appropriate. As you know, the House knows the shielding programme ended in September. But I think what people need to recognise with the CEV, with the clinically extremely vulnerable, is that we should treat them with caution, just as anybody with any respiratory disease should treat the clinically extremely vulnerable with caution, respect them, and act with responsibility.
Edward Timpson.
Mr. Speaker, and I fully endorse the Prime Minister's statement. It's a significant step forward. But whilst also wanting to get more confidence back into the country, people also want some consistency so they can plan ahead. And to that end, will he look at what we do with schools and education more generally, particularly around making them an essential part of our national infrastructure, so that in any future occasions where we may be considering restrictions across the country, schools, nurseries, colleges and universities are at the very back of that queue, so that we make sure that that lost learning we saw during this pandemic doesn't happen again.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and that's why we're ensuring that schools are able to be as COVID secure as possible, sending out 350,000 CO2 monitors, 9,000 air cleaning units, amongst other steps that we're taking to protect schools. And I think it's very, very important that we should get the message over to everybody that schools are safe, and not one of the many things, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition got wrong.
Alex Davis-Jones.
The Prime Minister, in outlining his reckless plan for living with COVID, announced that he is relying on the British public to apply personal responsibility when it comes to the virus. Does this also apply to the Prime Minister?
She says it's a reckless plan, Mr. Speaker. That was exactly the word that the Right Honourable Gentleman Leader of the Opposition used to describe the July 19th openings. I wonder whether she still believes that.
Al Carper.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take the Prime Minister's statement, if I may, as his application to join the COVID recovery group. He's very welcome indeed. I only wish it had been sooner. Can I ask him a question, though? On all of the lockdowns and the serious restrictions have all been implemented using the Public Health Act, some of them by ministerial decree, only approved by Parliament retrospectively. If we're to believe that next time will be different, why doesn't this plan include proposals to change the Public Health Act to make ministers more accountable to Parliament now, rather than kicking it into the long grass, waiting for the results of the COVID public inquiry?
Well, I know that my right honourable friend is a staunch Thatcherite, and he will recall it was Margaret Thatcher who actually promulgated the Public Health Act in 1984. It has served this country well for a long time. I'll consider the point that he makes. It is a valuable one, but I think it may also be something that the inquiry will want to consider themselves.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With 38,000 new COVID cases today, can the Prime Minister explain which public health experts advised abandoning testing and isolation, and when will that advice be published?
Yes, I thank her very much. And as you know, cases are falling, hospitalisations are falling, and the number of excess deaths from Omicron is actually in negative territory, and we consult a wide range of scientific opinion, including SAGE and clearly CSA and CMO, but the decisions are for ministers, and we take them.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, unlike the opposition, the Prime Minister has got all the big decisions right through the pandemic. But will he agree with me that we should never return to a full lockdown, and any isolation should be targeted? It should be the clinically vulnerable, the elderly and the Labour front bench.
Not in that order. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has put it brilliantly and succinctly, and I have nothing to add.
Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberty is always better than the alternative. As long as everybody can share in that liberty equally. So the anxiety for some of us, especially those who represent very poor communities, is that if you are symptomatic and free testing is ended, you may end up having to pay £59, £119 for a PCR test. And then on top of that, if you do the responsible thing and stay away from work, you may be in a job where you're not going to get any money at all, or you're going to get pathetic sick pay. Don't we have to make sure, if we are going to make sure that everybody shares in that liberty equally, that the poorest in Britain get a better deal?
The right honourable gentleman makes a very important point, but I think that overwhelmingly, first of all, there will be statutory sick pay available, but secondly, I think if I may say so, I think he underestimates people's sense of responsibility, and also people's willingness to do the right thing by others.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome what the Prime Minister has set out today, and I especially welcome his commitment to Scunny Hospital. And I also welcome his continuation of the ONS survey study, not least because my mum and dad have been taking part in it, and it's given them something to do throughout the course of COVID, rather than text me constantly. But can I, on NHS testing, as somebody who knows works in the NHS myself, I like getting my test before I book on duty. It makes me feel safe when I'm going into care homes to attend patients or elsewhere. So as he sets out how testing will continue in March, can he set out clearly what the situation will be for testing of NHS workers?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend very much for his service in the NHS and throughout the pandemic, and I've seen him in action, but also to say that on his point about the NHS, that will be for the NHS to determine themselves.
Lawrence Session-Lurby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned this afternoon it's about personal responsibility, and it is. It's about our personal responsibility not to inadvertently pass on that virus to someone who's vulnerable. It's about our personal responsibility to do the right thing if we have the symptoms and if we have COVID. It's about our personal responsibility to think about our neighbours, our friends, our carers, the people who need those restrictions lifted. What does the Prime Minister have to say to my vulnerable constituents in Vauxhall who are concerned that this personal responsibility that the Prime Minister wants us to take may inadvertently lead to them catching COVID?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and she's right to focus on personal responsibility, but the other part of the strategy is the vaccinations. And this is a vaccine-led strategy. And that's what enables us, and that's what enables us now to rely on people's personal responsibility as well.
The Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, can I very much welcome the statement by the Prime Minister and the way he set out the argument with regards to living with COVID in respecting and restoring people's freedoms and at the same time with regards to protecting public health. The key advance that we have for future, Prime Minister, is that we have the mapping exercise with vaccination centres already in place, such as in Medway. With that being the case, will the Prime Minister also thank the excellent volunteers and the NHS staff in Medway and look at their bid for a new Medway hospital in my constituency for the future?
No, Mr. Speaker, I better be careful what I say about more hospitals. We want to build as many hospitals as we possibly can, but we'll have to look at his plan. I do want to thank the Medway volunteers. I want to thank everybody still involved in the vaccination campaign. There are still millions of people, Mr. Speaker, who have not yet had their booster, and I urge them to get it.
Catherine West.
Lovely to have the Prime Minister with us today, not filling in his questionnaires or having his busy meetings with the police. Mr. Speaker, can he confirm or deny the reports that there is a sell-off plan to the Vaccine Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, which has been founded on the values and the mission of people like Dr. Sarah Gilbert, who invented the AstraZeneca vaccine?
Well, I think we can probably all agree. We're going to stay with these images, by the way, shortly from the Palace of Westminster. I think we can probably agree, can't we? Just in terms of the naked politics of the thing, that was probably the single biggest cheer the Prime Minister has received from his backbenchers for some weeks, if not months. And some might have seen in his demeanour there a return to a swagger that we haven't seen for some time. For why? We'll send you back to look at the pictures, by the way, from the House of Commons. Why? Because of this announcement that he is looking to Britain now to, as he puts it, live with COVID. Specifically, we're talking about self-isolation coming to an end from Thursday. The Prime Minister said we do not need to pay the cost of COVID any longer, while stressing and referring to some of the data on hospitalisations and indeed future threats, that COVID will not suddenly disappear. But he said we have to rely on our sense of responsibility to one another. Keir Starmer said, we do not want restrictions for a moment longer than is necessary, but we have to take the public with us. He described what was announced by the Prime Minister, living with COVID, that announcement, as a half-baked announcement. Prime Minister getting the biggest laugh of the day when he said that the Leader of the Opposition has a ferocious grip on the wrong end of the stick. Claire Fox, free speech commentator and much else besides, member of the House of Lords. Do you like being reminded of that? I don't, probably not. Is
No.
with me. What did you make of all that?
Well, actually, first of all, it's quite historic.
Yes.
I, for one, am absolutely delighted. I do think it's rather late, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to celebrate for now. And it's great to hear any politicians, whatever side they're on, talking about the importance of liberty, personal responsibility, no laws, and so on and so forth. I mean, it feels a little bit like, God, I said that months ago. But I do think it's important to recognise that actually Boris Johnson may or may not be saved by this kind of thing. I really don't care. But from the point of view of what the country does, this is actually a genuine step forward, and I think does give leadership to the world, by the way. I think it's very positive. It will encourage people. I thought, by the way, that Keir Starmer didn't quite get the tone right. I mean, he actually said, this is, you promised a plan, but there's no plan, it's chaos, it's all over the place.
Was he slightly shown up by his backbencher Chris Bryant then?
Yeah, I thought so. Chris Bryant actually kind of got in there, didn't he? But I also thought with the Keir Starmer comments, it was like, well, what he's saying is, I need a point-by-point plan. And that's exactly the kind of way that people have learnt to be dependent on, tell us what to do at every given moment and dot the I's and cross the T's. And actually, people now want to be free and reassured. And I suppose the points about the clinically vulnerable, that the Labour benches, the Green benches, such as they are, the one Green MP, the SNP wants to stress, nobody should ever forget the clinically. But if you're clinically vulnerable with or without COVID, and we should always be sensitive to people who've got particular health issues, but you can't reorganise the whole society around, and restrictions on society around protecting the clinically vulnerable. Now we should protect the clinically vulnerable. But actually, everybody else needs to start rebuilding
without
society.
spending £2 billion a month on a testing regime.
Treating everybody as though they're clinically vulnerable, effectively.
Just as a parliamentarian, and this is technical, but I was struck by the language. He talked about the parts of the Coronavirus Act which will be expired. It's a funny verb to use, but what does he mean by that? That
well,
will just lapse?
Yes, because the truth is that there hasn't really been much opportunity to vote for them. I mean, that in a way, they're in an imposition. I think Mark Harper made a very important contribution there, though, because he actually said it's actually the Public Health Act, which is the legislation that's brought in actually the most draconian restrictions on people's lives. So it will be great to get rid of the Coronavirus Act, because it scares me that it exists. And however, Mark Harper wanted to say, can we now look straight away at the Public Health Act? And this was interesting in terms of how Boris Johnson responded. He didn't say no. He did say we might wait for the inquiry, but he did say, I'm listening to my honourable friend, and we might well look at that. In other words, it is no doubt about it, the COVID recovery group, some will say the mad right-wingers or the mad libertarians, but actually people who have, I think, fairly consistently, perfectly reasonably raised queries, people like Graham Brady, chair of the 1922 committee, they're basically holding the government to account in a way that I think the Labour Party have failed to do during this period. And I think that's, in some ways, it was a refreshing sign of a democracy that's alive, even though in a bizarre kind of a way, it was within the Conservative Party that we saw the most interesting political exchanges.
Not just Conservatives. The DUP, Sammy Wilson said, what nudge tactics will be used to restore confidence? And
exactly, and we referred to that earlier. Sorry, you're absolutely right. I mean, Sammy Wilson, actually, from the DUP, has been one of the very strong voices, again, at querying, for example, things like, do children really need to be vaccinated? Shouldn't we be wary of that? What about masking for children in schools? I've heard him speak out on some of these things. What I mean is that there's been a group of people, and I wasn't really trying to make a party political point, because I've tried to do it as well, by the way, in the Lords, and a group of us have, that have said, don't call us COVID-idiots, don't call us COVID deniers, stop saying everybody's an anti-vaxxer. There are some anti-vaxxers who I find distasteful, but there are people who've got legitimate questions to ask, and that's what you want Parliament to do. I'm simply saying that it's been disappointing that the Labour Party has not done that more consistently over the last 2 years. But as you rightly pointed out, Chris Bryant sounded closer to it.
Well, just on Chris Bryant, this might seem petty to some people, but I think there's a profound point behind it. He was maskless in the chamber.
Exactly, I know.
And there was a sprinkling of Labour backbenchers who weren't wearing COVID masks, set against the Conservative benches where virtually everybody didn't have a mask. My point is about tribalism and tribal belonging, and how that feeds into the bigger question about whether what Boris Johnson has just said in the Houses of Parliament, whether his writ will run into every single workplace, into every single NGO and charity and civil service department, whether actually the signs will go, the masks will go, or whether the mindset will remain.
Well, we discussed earlier that the danger here is that that mindset has been socialised into us all, and the fears, the uncertainties means that they won't just disappear overnight, which is why I'm suggesting that political leaders of all sides need to encourage and be positive. I think that note that Labour again said, which is, where's your scientific evidence? What about this? What about that? That sows those seeds of uncertainty, doesn't it? And tries to imply, by the way, that this is all for political capital. And I think that's completely wrong. But the scientific evidence, as well as the political and social evidence of the damage that lockdowns have done, a point that Graham Brady and various of the parliamentarians made there, I mean, there's been a cost to pay here. I think there's a book out by Professor Mark Woolhouse, I think it is, called The Year the World Went Mad. And he was on stage, and he's saying the cost of lockdowns per se is something that we've got to really be honest about, because we should never go into them again, and we heard that reflected in the House. So I'm hoping now that this is the start of almost like a counter-attack on those people who are risk-averse and too nervous to break from the COVID norm. But we need to go back to the old normal much more.
Much more from Claire Fox coming up. You're still looking at the Prime Minister there on his feet in the House. He was talking about the necessity of saving some money, £2 billion every month, the cost of the testing programme, which is to go now. We need to make some money as well, so here's a commercial break.
Hello, I'm Tamsin Roberts. It's 5:33 in the GB newsroom. The legal requirement to isolate after a positive coronavirus test will end on Thursday in England. Free universal testing will end on April the 1st. Boris Johnson told the Commons he will remove all remaining domestic coronavirus restrictions in law, end routine contact tracing, and that schools will no longer have to test twice a week. He told MPs the country will now rely on vaccines and treatments to tackle COVID, as he unveiled his new plan for living with COVID.
We now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. We will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others.
The UK will offer an additional COVID-19 booster jab from spring for the most vulnerable. Health Secretary Sajid Javid says people aged 75 years and over, residents in elderly care homes and people aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed will be eligible. These groups will be able to receive their fourth jab from around 6 months after their last dose. In other news, Russia's Presidential Security Council is meeting to consider recognising the independence of Russia-backed separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. It follows televised appeals by leaders of the rebel-held Donetsk Republic and Luhansk Republic. Vladimir Putin says Russia is not considering annexing the two regions and formally adding them to its own territory. But Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told the Commons Britain has a strong cause for concern that Russia is still committed to an invasion of Ukraine. Environmental agencies have issued hundreds of alerts for flooding as Storm Franklin continues to sweep across the UK. It follows yellow weather warnings that have been in place since this morning, but have now been removed. Transport networks have been suffering further delays, with some train operators asking passengers not to travel because of the conditions. 32,000 homes are still without power following Storm Eunice over the weekend. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. Don't go anywhere though, Brazier will be with you in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, if you are just switching on, in the last hour we heard from the Prime Minister, one of those significant punctuation marks in Britain's COVID story. It appears Prime Minister was announcing the end of COVID restrictions for England. We'll labour that point, not being followed, at least not yet, by the devolved authorities. It included scrapping the legal requirement to self-isolate, even if you should test positive for the virus. I think the Prime Minister is still on his feet. We may dip back into what's happening in Parliament. In fact, there you see Boris Johnson still addressing the House of Commons. Some of those opposition benches just beginning to thin out, but the government backbenches fairly densely populated at this stage. And as you look at those pictures, and apologies if you are listening on radio, let me tell you, and you could certainly hear it if you were listening on the radio, one of the biggest cheers received by the Prime Minister for some weeks or months in response to his announcement today. So whatever else in terms of the philosophical implications of today's announcement, short-term tactically for the Prime Minister, a significant fillip, it would appear, for him. But what does it mean for you? What does it mean if you're perhaps dealing with a long-term health problem, if you are immunosuppressed? What about a fourth jab? Questions that people are mulling over, I'm sure, would have done without the PM's statement, but perhaps even more so now. Let's turn to NHS GP Dr Mo Kaki to reflect on some of that. Doctor, thanks for your time, as ever, do appreciate it. The Prime Minister says we have to learn to live with COVID.
Well, I think we've known that from the beginning, haven't we? We've known that COVID is not going anywhere, and we've had to learn to live with it, and we're going to have to continue that. I think the question mark about the announcement is whether or not it's too soon. And I think we have obviously been trying to pioneer as much as we can. But of course, I think the worry is there some political element to this, and has this been well thought out? We know, of course, COVID is still spreading. We know that 1 in 20 people have the Omicron variant at the moment, and we know that it is transmissible. So I think that's where the concern comes in, especially if you're not someone who's been vaccinated or potentially immunocompromised.
When you say people are concerned, are you one of them, Doctor?
I think for the medical professionals, we're always urging caution with this, because we've seen how devastating COVID-19 can be. And we know that this Omicron variant has been kind to us. We know that it's not been as bad, but we think that's related to a few different things. The variant hasn't been so bad. And of course, more people have been vaccinated and taken that up. But we are always a bit cautious to drop all restrictions, especially things like not self-isolating when you've got COVID-19 because we know it's not like the flu. It is more dangerous, and it's and I think when the Prime Minister mentioned that, I think some of us were a bit anxious because we know that it has had some devastating effects.
That's interesting. I mean, my ears pricked up because it was used this morning in the media rounds that I think Paul Scully, the Minister, was saying this, likening Omicron to flu, and the Prime Minister just made that point there. But you're saying, as a clinician, Mo, that actually it's not a fair comparison. This is not the flu.
That's right. I think what we've realised is that whilst the flu definitely can highly affect those who are vulnerable or immunocompromised, and that's why we always have vaccines every year for those populations. What we've seen with COVID-19 is that the virus does lots of different things, and it also has these long-term side effects like long COVID. And so I think that's why we're finding that there is a difference, and in some ways it's more important that we're cautious with this because of the long-term effects. Now, I think what they're trying to say is this: it's like the flu in the respect that it's not going away. It's going to be with us for a long time. But that is probably where the similarities mostly end, because this is a more serious virus.
But I think we need to... yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, but that is ultimately a political judgment, isn't it? It becomes a political rather than a political judgment at what point you call it. And they are saying, OK, it's reasonably like flu. Some of the dynamics are like flu. They are saying 1 in 2,000 deaths rather than the initial 1 in 200 that we remember with such sadness and bitterness, perhaps. It's moved on. It's evolved. We've learned to deal with it on much better through, whether it's antivirals, whether it's through boosters, whatever the natural immunity, whatever the reason is. There is a political decision here which says this is now manageable. 1 death in 2,000 cases is manageable, as it would be with flu. And, you know, people will, of course, listen to clinicians. You're at the sharp end. There's an open letter from clinicians today. The BMA chairman has come out and said, we're not happy about this. But at the end of the day, it's for our elected representatives to make the call.
Yes, of course. I mean, look, ultimately, that's what it's always been throughout, and that's the way our lives are governed. But I think the key point is that us as clinicians need to raise our voice, because I think it's very important for us to realise that, as you said, at the sharp end, we do see those suffering. We do look after those who are in the long-term throes of this. And I think that's where it's really important to listen to that. Now, it could be the fact that, yes, as you mentioned, the political machinations, the other things going on at this current time in the climate, and also I think the fact that the Omicron variant has been kind to us have all led us to this point. But I think we really still need to be very careful. If you do have COVID-19, I think it's still important to look after yourself, to try to isolate from those who could be vulnerable. And of course, we urge caution at all times, really.
OK, Mo Kharki, good of you to spare the time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Let's go back to Claire Fox to reflect on that specific point that Mo Kharki, Claire, was making, that this isn't flu, he says. We trust his judgment. He's at the sharp end. He's a clinician. But I mentioned the letter, the open letter that was sent today by a number of esteemed epidemiologists and surgeons, and there are lots of letters at the end of names as I look at that list. But the joint statement they've agreed includes phrases like this: we believe humanity is in a race against the virus. For the 1 in 4 people in the UK who are clinically vulnerable, the current approach appears a perilous and politicised pandemic response. To speak personally, I don't mind our clinicians expressing clinical opinions. For me, that veers very close to politics.
But that's the problem, isn't it? That over a period of time, what's happened is that politics has been replaced by public health concerns. And as it happens, clinicians and doctors, I mean, they're always the more cautious. They're the ones who kind of go, we see everything through the prism of health. And I think what we have, as a society now, got to balance is that there's more to life than health concerns. And I think that the flu comparison, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable, I think, to say it's not like the flu. We know it's not like the flu. But what I do think is valid to say is that the link between cases and severe illness has been broken. And then for clinicians of any description, and then politicians actually in that debate, we heard this, people saying, well, what about the other possible variants that might be worse in the future? And then that really is a kind of stay forever, cautious, fearful, looking over your shoulder for the next health thing.
Because there might be another variant.
You never know what's going to happen. And what I'd suggest is that we've got hundreds of thousands of missing children from school. We've got a whole range of psychological, I think, fear, wandering around, people being unsure. What I think we have to do is to now grasp the opportunity of a joyful return to living our lives as normally as we possibly can without being irresponsible around people who are particularly ill.
It would be nice to see people really picking up the cudgels on this point, because I think there's a fearfulness in some quarters. I mean, just to cite one example, and people will, take pot shots of him for making a ludicrous example, but a story we covered about 6 months ago, and I've not heard hide nor hair of it since, and I wonder why that is. And the story was the amount of stalking going on in the UK had risen very, very sharply. Of course it has. You're a stalker, you put the mask on, you're incognito, the facial recognition software and the cameras doesn't work anymore, etc., etc., etc. I think it was the Victims Commission, whoever it was, made something of it at the time, and you sort of felt like then they took the foot off the gas because they were aligning themselves with groups they didn't want to be aligned with. Well, actually, come on, guys. If masks are bad, if restrictions are bad, come out and say so.
Let's be frank. We took, for whatever reasons, as a society, led by the government, measures that were completely antisocial. We atomised society, we demobilised everybody, and we told them that the way that you could contribute to society was to sit at home and do nothing. And we know that millions had to carry on working. But the reason I say that is because it's not a surprise that if you destroy society in that way, that antisocial things happen, right? So, stalking, it's like our sense of solidarity, of taking care of each other, was replaced by looking at each other fearfully as though we were a risk to each other. And I think that's my concern, is I want to get over that, right? I want us not to be able to hide behind a mask, but also to smile at each other, to go and offer Mrs Smith a helping hand if she's feeling a bit nervous about going to shops because she hasn't been out for 2 years. Let's have parties. Somebody actually just said, we want street parties. We want to start remembering that what makes us a society is our relationships between each other, our sociability, trusting each other. And I think in that sense we should be encouraging and basically the antisocial stalkers, the antisocial obsessive demanders that you wear a mask. I don't mind if people wear a mask. But the demand is that we all wear them, or we're killers, or granny killers. That is in the past now, and all to the good. And so the joy of life is what we should embrace now.
We need a bank holiday, don't we?
I celebrate. What a few.
Niall Gardner's come in, and you'll see him and listen to what he's got to say very shortly, but listening intently to our conversation about what the Prime Minister has just announced in the Palace of Westminster. If you are just tuning in, from Thursday, no more self-isolation. The Prime Minister stressing we need to learn to live with COVID. But we're going to change tack a little bit. The culture wars, as we call them in Britain, weaken us at just the time when countries like Russia and China wish us the most harm. That's what the Conservative Party chairman, Oliver Dowden, said. I'm afraid this news is a little bit old. It was a speech that was made more than a week ago, but it was rather ignored at the time, which is why we're doing it. He said woke cancel culture was a, quote, pernicious new ideology that needed to be taken seriously. Here to talk more about this, Niall Gardner, the director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, who helped organise that speech by Oliver Dowden. Niall, thanks for coming and appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Colin.
Well, before we get into the cancel culture wars and the culture wars more generally, what did you make of the Prime Minister's announcement today? And coming in, I mean, you are a Brit, but you've lived for decades in the States. Can you offer us any sort of Atlanticist perspective on this?
Yeah, actually, I thought the Prime Minister did very well. A breath of fresh air. And so you see that Great Britain leading on the world stage, removing COVID restrictions entirely, the first major country in the world to do so. This is an example, I think, for the rest of the world. In the United States, they're still stuck in, mask wearing, vaccine passports, vaccine, mandates, etc. And, you have a country that is still, living under a culture of fear with regard to the Biden administration's approach towards COVID. And the UK has completely rejected this culture of fear. And so you have all these controls.
The death rates are pretty bad. And Niall, what would you say to those people who would say that's because actually, if you look at older people in the US versus older people in the UK, your rates of inoculation are actually pretty low?
There's tremendous sort of variation across the United States. But the reality is, those states that have adopted policies of advancing freedom, Florida, for example, are not faring worse than the likes of, say, New York. And so, the whole COVID debate has been tremendously politicized in the United States. And if you go to any Democrat-run city, they're still living, months behind where the United Kingdom is in terms of getting rid of restrictions. And at the end of the day, many Americans feel these restrictions in place are about a culture of, power and control rather than the science. And so it's wonderful actually to see the Prime Minister leading on the world stage here. Britain is leading the way. I hope the United States will follow soon.
I know you're sick of me asking you this question because I always put it to you about what would Margaret Thatcher do if she was in charge right now. But I thought it was quite interesting there. John Redwood, who I think we could probably agree is a Thatcherite, took to his feet, former cabinet minister, and said the government needs to do more to actually to push back. To push back the boundaries of, in this case, as he put it, COVID restrictions. But there are those people. Oliver Dowden seemed to suggest this in his speech at your place in Washington over a week ago, that actually that applies just as ably to the whole conversation around cancel culture. Your side of the argument, that the free speechers, in your case the Conservatives, are not doing it. You're just batting it back gently when you should be launching an all-out assault.
Yeah. Well, I think, Margaret Thatcher's position would have been very clear. We need to roll back the frontiers of the state, reduce, big government control. I think she would have opposed ideologically a lot of the sort of lockdown measures that you saw.
Helped by the fact she was a scientist,
throughout the pandemic. I think she would have opposed those, actually. And, of course, with regard to the culture war issues as well, she would have fought front and centre on those issues also. And Oliver Dowden's speech in Washington was a very important speech. That really was the first clear statement by a British cabinet minister in a major address, calling for the defeat of a far-left cancel culture, this poisonous ideology that is attacking freedom of speech, freedom of thought on both sides of the Atlantic, actually. And so this was a very significant speech. It was, of course, heavily attacked on the left, but widely praised by Conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic, and a very significant address. And I hope that the Conservative government will actually implement fully everything that Dowden talked about in his wonderful speech.
I wonder what Claire Fox thinks, because I'm nervous. I like the idea of civil society sorting this stuff out. I get nervous when mainstream politicians start weighing in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to grasp this fact. Margaret Thatcher, whom I fought for as many years as she was in power, as an aside, nobody, you could say she wouldn't have done it, but I didn't think Boris Johnson was going to do what he's just done. So I'm delighted Boris Johnson has rolled back and given a lead, but we've just had 2 years of Boris Johnson's government clamping down on liberty and freedom. And on the free speech cancel culture point, which is where I'm linking this, actually I have not seen a forceful attack on cancel culture from the Conservatives. In other words, I think this goes beyond left and right. I mean, I'm on the left, and I am pro-free speech, anti-cancel culture, and I have been condemned by members of the Conservative Party in the House of Lords, apart from anything else, for being one of those libertarian, irresponsible people, just as an aside. And there's been attacks on free speech around COVID restrictions, as you know. So I think that there is a branch of the left, definitely, the identitarian left, that has led the attacks on free speech. But sadly, there has not been a consistent left or right defence of free speech. So I was delighted with Dowden's speech, but I'm not optimistic he's going to win the day.
Just a point of clarification, when Claire says for Thatcher, I think you meant very much fought against.
Fought against. I said fought, not for.
There'll be people.
Oh my goodness!
There's peas on forks that are suspended in disbelief.
Fought against Margaret Thatcher. All I'm saying is I didn't think Boris Johnson, the libertarian, was going to do that. So who knows what would have happened?
No, we've got very little.
Yes.
About 30
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for both, the left and the right to be working together in defence of free speech.
Good.
And to defeat this pernicious cancel culture. Conservatives, I think, are standing up primarily on this, but we also need to see people on the left as well fighting against this very dangerous ideology, because we live in a free society. We have to defend freedom and liberty.
OK, well, today, in a sense, was the Prime Minister's day. We're going to let him have the last word. He's still on his feet, Boris Johnson, in the House of Commons. Let's take you back there for 20 seconds or thereabouts. Jubes & Co. will be next. Our thanks to Claire Fox and Niall Gardner.
Red weather warning
thanks
for
watching.
Friday. Ensuing hurricane-force winds have caused extensive damage to buildings and trees. They've also caused power outages and widespread travel delays. After a day of disruption...
That was Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary. Boris Johnson had just left, but you know what we mean. Dukes and Co's next.
Hello. The winds are easing as Storm Franklin clears away, but there's going to be some heavy rain around, certainly for a time tomorrow, before we see brighter skies generally through the afternoon. There's Franklin disappearing, and we've got a brief bump in the isobars, a brief ridge before this next weather system comes in, and it'll be that brings some heavy rain during tomorrow. For many, though, it'll be dry and fine through this evening. The winds continuing to ease down, still quite gusty on the east coast, but even here the winds ease through the night. Some patches of frost over northeast Scotland with some clearer skies before that next set of weather fronts arrive, bringing cloud and patchy rain initially, but then some heavy rain to western Scotland and Northern Ireland by dawn. And the winds will pick up once more in the northwest. Temperatures mostly holding up above freezing, but as I said, through this evening we could see some pockets of frost. Certainly tomorrow morning, that rain is going to be heavy across initially southern Scotland, but then spreading into northern England and Wales, easing a little as it spreads over the Midlands, and then just turning things damp across East Anglia and the southeast around the early afternoon. Clearing away and then leaving sunny spells and just a few scattered showers, which will be of snow over the hills in Scotland. Temperatures 8, 9 across the north, 10, 11 further south. Breezy, but nothing like as windy as today. During Tuesday evening, again, clear skies will allow it to turn quite cold for a time before we see another weather front, bringing more rain and strong winds back across Scotland, again with a bit of snow likely on the hills here. And that rain will only slowly creep southwards during Wednesday, spreading into Northern Ireland and eventually Northern England. For most of England and Wales, though, it'll be dry on Wednesday, just a few showers for Wales and the southwest. Some sunny spells across the east. It will be windy, though, so the temperature's 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with that wind on Wednesday. And through the rest of this week, it stays pretty lively. Gusty winds, but not as stormy. Some further spells of rain, but also some sunnier days as well.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation?